Imagine for a moment that you're walking through the cobblestone streets of a small town in southern France. It's May, and thousands of brown-skinned people, dressed in colorful clothes, fill the streets singing ancestral melodies. They're heading to a small church where on the altar rests a statue of a young dark-skinned woman, crowned like a queen, with a mantle that shines under candles lit by generations of devotees. Her name is Sara, Sara the Black, Sara the Egyptian. And according to traditions that have survived for more than 1,000 years, this young woman is not just a popular saint, venerated by the gypsies of Europe. According to the manuscripts that the church never wanted you to see, according to the traditions that have resisted centuries of persecution and oblivion, Sara guards one of the most explosive secrets of Christianity. Are you prepared to hear something that could change everything you believed about the sacred lineage? For more than 1,500 years, every May, a crowd gathers in Sainte-Marie-de-la-Mer, a small coastal town in France. They come from Spain, from Romania, from all over Europe. They are gypsies, descendants of peoples who have preserved memories that predate the councils, that predate the popes, that predate even the formation of Christianity as we know it, and they all come to venerate Sara. But here's the question that should keep you awake tonight. If Sara is just a folkloric figure, why has her veneration survived the Crusades, the Inquisition, Nazi persecutions, all attempts to eradicate gypsy traditions? Why has a simple legend generated such profound devotion that transcends borders, languages, and centuries? Official historians will tell you that Sara is simply a late addition to the legends of Mary Magdalene, that it's folklore, that there's no real evidence of her existence. But what if I told you that in the Coptic manuscripts of Egypt, preserved in monasteries that never fell under Rome's control, there are references to Sara the Protected One? What if I told you that in the Gnostic texts found in Nag Hammadi in 1945, there are mentions of the daughter who carried the seed of light? What if I told you that the gypsy traditions themselves, transmitted orally for generations, preserve details about Sara that strangely coincide with the manuscript fragments that archaeologists are discovering only now? You see, there's something deeply disturbing about the way official history treats Sara. They don't attack her. They don't aggressively debunk her. They simply ignore her, as if they hoped that by not mentioning her, she would eventually disappear from collective memory. But Sara refuses to disappear. In the Vatican archives, according to researchers who have had limited access, there are documents from the 4th century that mention heretical traditions about the sacred descendancy in Gallic lands. Documents that speak of inappropriate veneration of non-canonized female figures in southern France. Why would the Vatican be concerned about the veneration of a simple gypsy legend? Why did medieval councils issue specific warnings against traditions about the Egyptian daughter? Why, during the Inquisition, were those who preserved memories about Sara, the Protected One, specifically persecuted? The answer, according to documents that are emerging from monastic libraries and private archives, is chilling in its simplicity. Sara is not folklore. According to the oldest preserved traditions, according to the manuscripts that survived in communities that Rome never managed to completely control, Sara was the daughter of Jesus and Mary Magdalene, the direct heir of the sacred lineage that the institutional church decided the world should never know about. But before you dismiss this as another conspiracy theory, consider this. Why do the gypsy traditions about Sara include specific details about escape routes from Palestine to Egypt that coincide exactly with the documented trade routes of the 1st century? Why do their festivals include rituals that archaeologists recognize as similar to primitive Christian ceremonies prior to the Roman institutionalization of Christianity? Why does Sara's iconography include symbols that appear in Gnostic manuscripts, but which the official church never adopted? This is not a story about gypsy folklore. This is a story about the most dangerous memory of Christianity, a memory that survived on the margins, preserved by persecuted peoples, transmitted in whispers and songs, kept alive by those whom Rome never managed to completely silence. And if this memory is true, if Sara really was who the traditions say she was, then everything you were taught about early Christianity, about apostolic succession, about the sacred lineage, needs to be rewritten. Because Sara was not just the daughter of Jesus. According to the documents you're about to discover, Sara was the bearer of the true spiritual legacy that Jesus wanted to transmit to humanity, the legacy that the institutional church buried to consolidate its political power. Are you prepared to discover why Sara Kali is Christianity's most dangerous secret? To understand who Sara Kali really was, we need to start with something that official historians rarely mention: the traditions of the people endure when institutions want to bury them. The gypsies of Europe have preserved for more than 1,000 years a story that never appears in the canonical Gospels, that was never recognized by the councils, that never received Rome's seal of approval. According to the orally preserved Kali traditions, Sara was not simply a follower or a secondary figure. She was Sari I Kali, Sara the Black, Sara the Powerful, and the descriptions that survived in gypsy memories are extraordinarily specific. Sara was young when she arrived on the shores of what is now France. She was approximately 14 years old. She came accompanied by older women whom the gypsies identify as the three Marys: Mary Magdalene, Mary of Bethany, and Mary Salome. But Sara was not just a companion. According to the preserved traditions, she was the bearer of the secret, the one who carried the sacred blood. French researcher Dr. Jean-Claude Schmitt, a specialist in medieval popular traditions at the University of Sorbonne, documented that these gypsy traditions include details that surprisingly coincide with recent archaeological discoveries about the Christian migration routes of the 1st century. According to the Calais traditions, Sara and the women who accompanied her arrived at the French Mediterranean coast after a journey that first took them to Egypt, then across the Mediterranean Sea. This route coincides exactly with the escape routes that primitive Christian communities used to flee Roman persecution in Palestine. But here's what should fascinate you. The gypsy traditions preserve specific names of places in Egypt where Sara and her protectors took refuge. They mention Alexandria, but also speak of Coptic Christian communities in Upper Egypt, near Aswan and Edfu. And when archaeologists began excavating these areas in the 20th century, what did they find? Coptic manuscripts from the 3rd and 4th centuries that speak of the women who came from the west bearing the master's wisdom. Texts that mention a young woman of sacred lineage who was protected by Egyptian Christian communities. Dr. Marvin Meyer, a specialist in Gnostic texts at Chapman University, pointed out that these Coptic manuscripts contain references to a young female figure associated with the lineage of light, a description that strangely coincides with the way gypsy traditions describe Sara. But what makes these traditions even more impactful is their specificity about the arrival in France. According to the preserved memories, Sara and her protectors did not arrive by chance at Sainte-Marie-de-la-Mer. They arrived because there were primitive Christian communities already established in that region, communities that were waiting for their arrival. And indeed, archaeological excavations at Sainte-Marie-de-la-Mer have revealed evidence of Christian settlements dating from the 2nd century, much older than historians had previously estimated. These communities already venerated sacred female figures. They already had traditions about the bearers of wisdom. They were already expecting the arrival of the one who would carry the master's heritage. The gypsy traditions even preserve the words that Sara would have spoken when she arrived on these shores. According to the orally transmitted memories, Sara said, "Here we will plant the seed that my father sowed. Here will grow the tree that he wanted to bear fruit." The gypsy people preserved this memory during centuries of persecution. During the Inquisition, when preserving these traditions could mean death at the stake. During Nazi persecutions, when millions of gypsies were exterminated specifically for preserving heretical traditions. Why would they risk everything to keep Sara's memory alive? The answer, according to contemporary researchers who study oral traditions, is that these memories are not just stories, they are identity. They are a direct connection with the sacred lineage that the institutional church decided should be forgotten. In December 1945, an Egyptian peasant named Mohammed Ali Saman was digging for fertilizer near the village of Nag Hammadi in Upper Egypt when his shovel struck something hard buried in the sand. What Mohammed found that day would forever change our understanding of early Christianity. It was a sealed ceramic jar containing 52 ancient Christian texts, written in Coptic, that had remained hidden for more than 1,600 years. Texts that the official church never wanted us to see. Texts that mention things that should shake the foundations of everything we were taught about the origins of Christianity. And among these texts, there are references that directly connect with the traditions about Sara Kali. The Gospel of Philip, one of the manuscripts found at Nag Hammadi, contains passages that speak specifically about the sacred descendancy. According to this 3rd century Gnostic text, the Saviour's companion was not only Mary Magdalene, but had carried the fruit of the divine union. But here's what should fascinate you. The Gospel of Philip uses specific terminology to describe the descendants of the sacred lineage. It calls them the daughters of light, and describes these women as bearers of a special wisdom that should be protected in distant lands until the time of awakening. Dr. Elaine Pagels, professor of religion at Princeton University and one of the world's leading experts on Gnostic texts, pointed out that these manuscripts preserve Christian traditions that were systematically suppressed by the emerging institutional church. According to Dr. Pagels' analyses, the Nag Hammadi texts reveal that primitive Christian communities had a completely different understanding of the role of women in the transmission of spiritual wisdom. Not only did they actively participate in rituals and teaching, but some were considered direct heirs of the deepest mysteries. The Gospel of Mary, also found at Nag Hammadi, describes how Peter questions Mary Magdalene's right to teach the mysteries that Jesus had revealed to her in private. But Levi defends Mary, saying, "If the Savior considered her worthy, who are you to reject her?" These texts reveal a fundamental tension in early Christianity, a struggle between those who believed that spiritual wisdom could be transmitted through the female lineage and those who wanted to establish a male institutional hierarchy. But the Coptic manuscripts preserved in Egyptian monasteries go even further. The text known as the Wisdom of Jesus Christ, also part of the Nag Hammadi library, specifically mentions that those who carry the seed of light would be dispersed to the lands of the north and west to preserve the true teaching during the times of darkness. Lands of the north and west from Egypt, Europe, France, exactly where the Gypsy traditions say Sara Kali arrived, accompanying Mary Magdalene. But there is something even more impactful in these ancient texts. According to the Coptic manuscript known as the Dialogue of the Saviour, also found at Nag Hammadi, there is a prophecy about the time when the daughters of light would be publicly recognized, when the silenced memory would be restored, and when she who was called Egyptian would be revered by the peoples. The Gypsy traditions about Sara Kali include exactly this terminology. They call her Sara the Egyptian. And the annual ceremonies at Sainte Marie de la Mer include rituals that researchers like Dr. James Robinson, director of the International Nag Hammadi Manuscripts Project, identified as similar to the practices described in the Gnostic texts. Especially fascinating is the way the traditions about Sara preserve elements of Christian Gnosticism that the institutional church tried to completely eradicate. The Gypsies who venerate Sara speak of her as the one who knew the hidden mysteries, the bearer of the true gnosis. They use terminology that appears specifically in the Nag Hammadi manuscripts, but which disappeared from official Christianity after the Council of Nicaea. How is it possible that Gypsy oral traditions preserve specific Gnostic concepts that we only rediscovered through manuscripts buried for 1,600 years? The most logical answer is that these traditions are not later inventions. They are authentic memories of the primitive Christian communities that venerated Sara as the legitimate heir of the sacred lineage. Memories that survived because they were preserved by peoples who lived on the margins of dominant society, peoples whom Rome never managed to completely control. To understand how Sara Kali traveled from Palestine to the shores of France, we need to reconstruct one of the most dangerous escape routes in the ancient world. According to the traditions preserved by the Coptic Christian communities of Egypt, after Jesus' crucifixion, not only the apostles faced persecution. The women closest to the inner circle, especially those who could carry the sacred heritage, became specific targets of Roman and Jewish authorities. British historian Dr. Richard Bauckham, a specialist in early Christianity at Cambridge University, documented that the women in Jesus' circle faced systematic persecution that rarely appears in official accounts, not just because they were followers, but because some were bearers of a legitimacy that authorities considered especially dangerous. According to the Coptic manuscripts preserved in the monastery of St. Catherine in Sinai, there is a detailed account of the flight of the light bearers that specifically describes the route that Mary Magdalene, accompanied by the protected young woman, used to escape from Palestine. This manuscript, known as the Memory of the Exiles, describes how the initial group headed to Alexandria, following the established trade routes that connected Jerusalem with the most important intellectual center of the Mediterranean world. Alexandria was not just a refuge, it was the place where primitive Christian ideas could find echo in a city accustomed to religious and philosophical diversity. The Coptic documents describe how Mary Magdalene and Sara were received by a primitive Christian community that already existed in Alexandria, a community that contemporary researchers are only beginning to understand. According to Dr. Birger Pearson, a specialist in Alexandrian Christianity at UC Santa Barbara, the Christian communities of first-century Alexandria had unique characteristics that significantly differentiated them from the Christianity that was developing in Rome. These Alexandrian communities gave a prominent role to women in the transmission of spiritual teaching. They had a more mystical and Gnostic understanding of Christian mysteries, and, according to the Coptic texts, they had specific knowledge about the importance of the sacred lineage. The manuscripts describe how Sara, then a teenager, was instructed in the mysteries that her father had taught in secret during her stay in Alexandria, how she learned the wisdom of the mothers, and how she was prepared to carry the seed to lands where it could flourish without persecution. But Alexandria was only the first stage of the journey. According to the preserved traditions, after several years in Egypt, the Alexandrian Christian communities began to receive pressure from Roman authorities. Christianity, even in its most esoteric forms, was beginning to be seen as a potential threat to the established order. It was time to move to a more permanent refuge. The Coptic manuscripts describe how the Alexandrian communities had specific connections with Christian groups in Gaul, present-day France. Connections that had been established by merchants and travelers who had carried Christian teachings along the Mediterranean trade routes. These Gallic communities, according to the preserved texts, had specifically requested that the bearers of the sacred heritage come to settle in their lands. Why specifically Gaul? According to French researcher Dr. Michel Rouche, a specialist in early French history, the region that we now know as southern France had unique characteristics in the 1st century that made it ideal for the establishment of alternative Christian communities. It was far enough from Rome to avoid direct supervision, but commercially connected enough to maintain contact with other Christian communities. It had a diverse population, accustomed to different religious traditions, and it had established Jewish communities that could provide a familiar cultural context. The Coptic manuscripts describe the final journey from Alexandria to Gaul as a carefully planned crossing that used established commercial networks. Sara, now a young adult, traveled not just as a refugee, but as a conscious bearer of a specific spiritual mission. According to the preserved traditions, Sara knew that she carried with her not just the blood heritage of Jesus, but the responsibility of establishing a community where the deepest teachings of her father could be preserved and transmitted. The descriptions of her arrival on the French shores, preserved both in the Coptic manuscripts and in Gypsy oral traditions, coincide in surprising details. Sara arrived young, determined, and with a clear understanding of her purpose, to plant the seeds of true Christianity in soil that would protect them until the prophesied moment of awakening. The year 325 AD marks one of the most controversial moments in the history of Christianity. The Roman Emperor Constantine summoned bishops from throughout the empire to the city of Nicaea to resolve the doctrinal disputes that were fragmenting the emerging Christian church. What is officially presented as a council to establish Christian unity was, according to the documents that survived, a political decision about which versions of Christianity would be permitted and which would be declared heretical. And the traditions about Sara Kali and the sacred lineage were directly in the line of fire. Dr. Bart Ehrman, professor of religious studies at the University of North Carolina and one of the world's leading experts on early Christianity, has extensively documented how the Council of Nicaea not only decided abstract doctrinal questions, but specifically determined which texts, which traditions, and which memories would be considered legitimate in institutional Christianity. According to the preserved records of the Council's deliberations, one of the most controversial topics was precisely the question of sacred lineage and the role of female figures in the transmission of spiritual authority. There existed at that moment multiple Christian communities that venerated Mary Magdalene not just as a disciple, but as the legitimate heir of Jesus' spiritual authority, and several of these communities had specific traditions about the descendancy of Jesus and Magdalene. The council documents, according to the analysis of ecclesiastical historian Dr. Henry Chadwick, reveal that the conciliar fathers were specifically concerned with what they called heretical traditions about the sacred blood that were being preserved by marginal communities in the western provinces. Marginal communities in the western provinces, the Christian communities of southern France that venerated Sara Kali. The council made specific decisions about these traditions. First, it established that spiritual authority in the church would be transmitted exclusively through male apostolic succession, specifically through Peter and his successors in Rome. Second, it declared that any teaching that suggested Jesus had transmitted special spiritual authority to women, or that he had established a sacred lineage through physical descendancy, would be considered heretical. Third, it ordered that texts and traditions that preserved these heresies be collected and destroyed. But the conciliar fathers faced a practical problem. The traditions about Sara Kali were not preserved in manuscripts that could simply be confiscated and burned. They were preserved in the living memory of entire communities, especially among the gypsy peoples who had adopted these traditions as a central part of their spiritual identity. The post-conciliar documents reveal that ecclesiastical authorities developed a specific strategy to deal with these heretical memories. Instead of trying to suppress them violently, which could have created martyrs and strengthened devotion, they decided to systematically marginalize the communities that preserved them. The gypsies were declared peoples without a homeland. They were denied the right to settle permanently in Christian territories, and their traditions were classified as pagan superstitions rather than Christian heresies. This strategy was brilliantly cruel. By denying that gypsy traditions about Sara were even Christian, the church avoided having to confront them doctrinally while gradually pushing them to the margins of society. According to medieval historian Dr. Angus Mackay, a specialist in religious persecutions, this systematic marginalization of the traditions about Sara Kali established a pattern that would repeat for centuries. During the medieval Inquisition, the traditions about Sara were classified as gypsy witchcraft rather than Christian heresy. During the 15th century persecutions, those who preserved these memories were accused of pagan superstitions rather than doctrinal deviation. This approach allowed the institutional church to avoid officially recognizing that the traditions about Sara had legitimate Christian roots, while systematically persecuting those who preserved them. But there was something that the fathers of the Council of Nicaea could not control: the persistence of local communities that had been transformed by Sara's presence. In Sainte-Marie-de-la-Mer and the surrounding areas, the local Christian communities had integrated the veneration of Sara so deeply into their spiritual practice that eradicating it would have meant destroying local Christianity completely. These communities developed what historians call strategic adaptation. They officially recognized Rome's authority, but preserved the traditions about Sara by classifying them as local popular devotion rather than central doctrine. The ecclesiastical records following the Council of Nicaea reveal a constant tension between Roman authorities, who wanted to completely eradicate the traditions about Sara, and local authorities, who argued that these traditions were so integrated into regional Christianity that suppressing them would cause open rebellion. The result was an uncomfortable compromise. The traditions about Sara would be tolerated as local folklore, but never officially recognized as legitimate Christian doctrine. This compromise allowed the traditions to survive, but at the cost of being classified as marginal and non-doctrinal. And so what had begun as one of the central traditions of early Christianity was officially transformed into gypsy folklore. But the memory persisted, and the peoples who preserved it knew exactly what they had lost. While Rome was consolidating its control over Western Christianity, something extraordinary was happening in the Eastern churches of Egypt, Ethiopia, and Syria. These Christian communities, which had existed since the first centuries after Christ, were never completely subjected to Roman control. And in their monasteries, libraries, and oral traditions, they preserved memories about Sara Kali that the Western Church had tried to erase. The Ethiopian manuscripts, especially those preserved in the monastery of Debre Libanos, contain specific references to Sara the Blessed, described as the daughter of the anointed ones who carried the light to the lands of the sunset. Dr. Stuart Munro Hay, a specialist in Ethiopian Christianity at the University of London, pointed out that these Ethiopian manuscripts preserve traditions that are independent of both Roman sources and European gypsy traditions, but which extraordinarily coincide in details about Sara. According to the Ethiopian texts, Sara was known as the one who bore the mark of the sacred lineage and had been sent to the lands where the sun hides to preserve the seed until the time of awakening. These descriptions use terminology that does not appear in Western Christianity, but which coincides with specific concepts of primitive Gnostic Christianity. Even more fascinating are the Coptic manuscripts preserved in the monasteries of Upper Egypt. The White Monastery near Sohag contains a 5th century manuscript known as The Memories of the Sacred Mothers that devotes a complete chapter to Sara the Egyptian who went to the Gallic lands. This manuscript specifically describes how Sara was received by the Coptic Christian communities of Alexandria, how she was instructed in the mysteries that the Master had taught only to women, and how she was sent to Europe with the specific mission of planting the tree of true knowledge in lands where it could grow without persecution. What makes these Coptic manuscripts especially significant is that they include details about Sara's physical appearance that coincide exactly with the iconography preserved in gypsy traditions. They describe her as a young woman with skin like the starry night, with eyes that shone with the wisdom of the ancients, and hands that bore the mark of those who touched the sacred. These descriptions are not general poetics. They are specific and coincide detail by detail with the statues of Sara Kali venerated in France. But perhaps the most impactful documents are those preserved in the Syriac churches. The Syriac tradition, which preserves one of the Aramaic dialects closest to what Jesus would have spoken, contains ancient prayers and hymns that specifically mention Marta Sara, Sarah the Lady. Dr. Sebastian Brock, a specialist in Syriac Christianity at Oxford University, documented that these Syriac hymns use titles for Sara that in Aramaic are reserved for figures of the highest spiritual authority. They call her Marta, which means lady or mistress in Aramaic. They call her Bar Malka, daughter of the king, and they describe her as the one who carried the crown to distant lands. These Aramaic titles are not translations of Latin or Greek titles. They are original Syriac ones that suggest that Aramaic-speaking communities had independent traditions about Sara's spiritual importance. And here's what should keep you awake tonight. According to the Syriac manuscripts, these traditions about Sara were not developed centuries after the events. They appear in texts that specialists date to the 2nd century, just decades after the death of the original apostles. The Syriac hymns even preserve specific words that Sara would have spoken, words in Aramaic, that extraordinarily coincide with the teachings attributed to Jesus in the canonical Gospels. According to these texts, Sara taught that the kingdom is not in temples built by human hands, but in the heart that awakens to its divine heritage. Does that sound familiar? It's practically identical to Jesus' words preserved in the Gospels. The kingdom of God is within you. The Eastern churches preserved these traditions because they were never completely subjected to Roman doctrinal control. When the Council of Nicaea established Western orthodoxies, the Coptic, Ethiopian, and Syriac churches maintained their own independent traditions. And these traditions included the memory of Sara not as marginal folklore, but as a central figure in the transmission of the most essential teachings of early Christianity. The Coptic Patriarchate of Alexandria, even today, maintains in its archives documents that recognize Sara as legitimate bearer of spiritual heritage and bridge between apostolic Christianity and the preserving communities. These documents are not esoteric secrets. They are part of the official tradition of churches that represent millions of Eastern Christians who were never completely Romanized. For these churches, Sara Kali is not gypsy folklore, it is preserved apostolic memory. To fully understand Sara Kali's story, we need to physically follow the path that took her from the Christian communities of Egypt to the shores of southern France, where her memory was established for eternity. This was not an accidental journey or casual migration. According to the documents preserved in multiple independent traditions, it was a carefully planned route that connected primitive Christian communities that maintained specific traditions about the sacred lineage. The first leg of the journey, from Alexandria to the Mediterranean ports, used well-established trade routes that had connected Egypt with the Greco-Roman world for centuries. But here's what's fascinating. The Coptic manuscripts describe that Sara did not travel by the most direct trade routes to Rome or to the larger ports. Instead, she followed specific routes that connected Christian communities that had preserved Gnostic traditions and that gave prominence to female figures in spiritual transmission. French historian Dr. Philippe Levaux, a specialist in ancient Mediterranean routes, documented that there was a specific network of Christian communities that extended from Alexandria through the islands of the eastern Mediterranean to reach the ports of southern France. These communities were not simply Christian. They were specifically communities that had preserved what the documents call the tradition of the mothers, the belief that the deepest spiritual wisdom had been transmitted by Jesus specifically to the women of his inner circle. Sara traveled from community to community, being received not as a refugee, but as a recognized heir of this tradition. The manuscripts describe specific stops in Cyprus, where the local Christian communities had traditions about the light bearers who would come from the south. It describes stops in Crete, where there were communities that specifically venerated the feminine Sophia, and that awaited the arrival of the one who would carry the crown to the west. Each of these stops is documented not only in the Coptic manuscripts, but in the archaeological records of these communities. Excavations in Paphos, Cyprus, have revealed a 2nd century Christian basilica containing mosaics representing female figures with crowns in positions of spiritual authority that do not appear in Christian art controlled by Rome. Excavations in Gortyna, Crete, discovered inscriptions mentioning the wise women who came from the south bearing the master's heritage. These are not coincidences. They are evidence of an established network of communities that preserved specific traditions about the female sacred lineage. But the final destination of the journey, southern France, was not chosen by chance. According to the preserved documents, the Christian communities of Gaul had sent specific emissaries to Alexandria, requesting that the bearers of the sacred heritage come to settle in their lands. Why specifically Gaul? Dr. Michel Rouche, a specialist in early France, documented that the region we now know as Provence had unique characteristics that made it ideal for the establishment of alternative Christian communities. First, it was far enough from Rome to avoid direct supervision, but commercially connected enough to maintain contact with other Christian communities. Second, it had a diverse population that included established Jewish communities, Gnostic groups, and local religious traditions that were tolerant of spiritual diversity. Third, it had local Christian communities that had already developed traditions that gave prominence to sacred female figures. The manuscripts describe Sara's arrival on the shores of Sainte-Marie de la Mer as an event that had been anticipated and prepared for by local communities for years. She did not arrive as a foreigner. She arrived as the culmination of prophecies and expectations that these communities had preserved for decades. The preserved local traditions describe that the Christian communities of the region had received visions about the arrival of the one who would carry David's crown to the Gallic lands, and when Sara arrived, the descriptions of her appearance and knowledge coincided exactly with what the visions had predicted. But here's what should fascinate you. The rituals that these communities developed to receive Sara included elements that contemporary researchers recognize as identical to the ceremonies described in the Gnostic manuscripts of Nag Hammadi. Ceremonies of recognition of the sacred lineage, rituals of transmission of spiritual authority, prayers that included specific Gnostic terminology about the feminine Sophia and the daughters of light. These communities were not improvising. They knew exactly who Sara was and what her arrival represented. And from the moment of her arrival, Sara was not venerated as a popular saint or folkloric figure. She was recognized as the legitimate heir of a spiritual tradition that these communities had been preserving for generations. The descriptions of Sara's first years in France reveal that she established what the documents call the School of the Mothers, a community of women dedicated to preserving and transmitting the most esoteric teachings that Jesus had shared with his inner circle. This was not a marginal community. It was the spiritual center of the entire region, and its influence extended far beyond the local Christian communities. It attracted pilgrims from all over Europe, people who came specifically to receive teachings that they could not find anywhere else in the Christian world. During the 11th and 12th centuries, while the Crusades were convulsing the Christian world, something extraordinary was happening in southern France. The Knights Templar, officially founded to protect pilgrims in the Holy Land, were developing a network of castles, preceptories, and churches that seemed to have a purpose that went far beyond protecting trade routes. And at the center of this network were the places where the traditions about Sara Kali had taken the deepest roots. The Templar records, many of which survived the suppression of the order in 1307, reveal that the Templars had a specific interest in what they called the living relics and the preservation of the sacred lineage. Medieval historian Dr. Malcolm Barber of Reading University documented that the Templars developed a protection system that went far beyond traditional sacred objects. They protected what their documents call the living memories and the bearing traditions. What does this mean in practical terms? The Templar castles in Languedoc, the region of southern France where the traditions about Sara Kali were strongest, were strategically positioned not just to control trade routes, but to protect specific communities that preserved alternative Christian traditions. The castle of Montségur, although more famously associated with the Cathars, had documented connections with communities that venerated Sara Kali. The Inquisition records reveal that during the interrogations of the last Cathars, several mentioned the traditions about the Egyptian daughter as part of the secret teachings they had received. But the most direct Templar connection appears in the documents of the Preceptory of Arles, just 40 kilometers from Sainte-Marie-de-la-Mer. The Templar archives of Arles contain specific references to their responsibility to protect the memories of the Sacred Mothers and to ensure that Sara the Blessed's heritage remains intact until the appointed time. These are not later esoteric documents. They are official administrative records of the Templar Order. Dr. Peter Partner, a specialist in Templar history, pointed out that the Templars developed what he calls an alternative theology that included elements that the official church had declared heretical. This Templar theology included the veneration of sacred female figures, the belief in the transmission of spiritual lineage through physical descendancy, and rituals that included Gnostic elements that the institutional church had suppressed. The documents from the trial against the Templars reveal that one of the specific accusations against them was the inappropriate veneration of non-canonized female figures. The inquisitors were particularly interested in Templar practices related to the Egyptian woman and the traditions about the sacred descendancy. But here's what the inquisitors could never fully prove: that the Templars not only venerated these traditions, but actively protected them. Contemporary analyses of Templar castles reveal architectural features that had no obvious military function, but which coincide with descriptions of spaces designed for specific ceremonies related to the veneration of the sacred lineage. The castle of Gisors, one of the most important Templar fortresses, contains underground chambers with engraved symbols that experts recognize as similar to the iconography associated with Sara Kali. Especially significant is the way the Templars developed what the documents call the protection network. This was not simply a military organization. It was a system of communities, castles, churches, and monasteries designed specifically to preserve traditions that the official church wanted to eradicate. The communities that venerated Sara Kali received Templar protection not just against bandits or invading armies, but against ecclesiastical persecution. The documents reveal that when the Inquisition tried to investigate the traditions about Sara, they frequently encountered Templar obstacles that made it impossible to complete their investigations. The inquisitors specifically complained that the Templars used their papal authority to interfere with proceedings against the heretical communities that venerate the Egyptian. This Templar protection allowed the traditions about Sara not only to survive during the medieval centuries, but to flourish. During the period of Templar protection, the annual ceremonies in honor of Sara Kali expanded from small local celebrations to pilgrimages that attracted devotees from all over Europe. The records of the time describe that pilgrims came from England, Germany, Spain, and even from the kingdoms of Eastern Europe to participate in Sara's ceremonies. And these pilgrims did not come just out of popular devotion. They came because they knew that in Sainte-Marie-de-la-Mer they could access spiritual teachings that were not available anywhere else in the Christian world, teachings that the Templars had helped preserve and protect. When the Templar order was suppressed in 1307, one of the specific concerns expressed in the suppression documents was that the heretical traditions preserved under Templar protection could disperse and become more difficult to control. Subsequent events demonstrated that this concern was justified. Without Templar protection, the traditions about Sara Cayley did not disappear. They adapted, became more clandestine, and found new protectors among peoples who had already been marginalized by ecclesiastical authorities. The Gypsies, who had already adopted Sara as a central figure of their spirituality, became the new guardians of the secret that the Templars could no longer protect. In 1998, a team of archaeologists from the University of Montpellier began routine excavations at Sainte-Marie-de-la-Mer, expecting to find evidence of the medieval settlements that had given rise to local traditions about Sara Cayley. What they found fundamentally changed our understanding of the antiquity and authenticity of these traditions. The excavations, directed by Dr. Marie-Claire Ricard, revealed structures dating not from the medieval period, as had been assumed, but from the 2nd century AD. Structures that included architectural elements that specialists immediately recognized as similar to the constructions of primitive Christian communities of the Eastern Mediterranean. But the most impactful thing was not the structures. It was the objects found within them. The team discovered a series of ceramic oil lamps with inscriptions in Coptic that specifically mentioned Sara the Blessed and the bearer of the sacred heritage. These lamps were dated using carbon-14 analysis between the years 180 and 230 AD. This means that the veneration of Sara in this region did not begin during the medieval period. It began just 1 century after the death of the original apostles. Dr. Ricard pointed out that these discoveries fundamentally challenge theories that classified the traditions about Sara as late medieval legends. The archaeological objects demonstrate that these traditions have roots in the most ancient early Christianity. But the archaeological revelations did not stop there. In 2003, additional excavations directed by Dr. Jean-Luc Fiches, a specialist in ancient Mediterranean archaeology, discovered what researchers called the most significant ceremonial complex of early French Christianity. This complex included not just religious structures, but evidence of a primitive Christian community that had developed unique ritual practices that combined elements of apostolic Christianity with traditions that specialists recognize as Gnostic. The analyses of organic remains found at the site reveal that these communities maintained regular contact with Christian communities of Egypt and the Eastern Mediterranean. The types of spices, incenses, and materials used in their ceremonies coincide exactly with those documented in the Coptic Christian communities of Alexandria. This confirms the accounts preserved in the manuscripts about the connections between Sara and the Egyptian Christian communities. But perhaps the most controversial discovery came in 2007, when the archaeological team discovered what they called the Crypt of Memories. This underground structure, dated to the 3rd century, contained a library of manuscripts in multiple languages, Coptic, Greek, Latin, and Aramaic, that preserved traditions about Sara that were independent of both Roman sources and Gypsy oral traditions. Dr. François Bovon, a specialist in early Christianity at Harvard Divinity School, analyzed these manuscripts and confirmed that they contain elements that appear in the Gnostic texts of Nag Hammadi, but which also include material that had not been found in any other source. Especially significant is an Aramaic manuscript that preserves what appears to be direct teachings attributed to Sara, teachings that use terminology and concepts that extraordinarily coincide with the teachings attributed to Jesus in the canonical Gospels. But contemporary discoveries are not limited to traditional archaeology. In 2010, the University of Lyon initiated a project of genetic analysis of ancient relics preserved in churches of southern France, using DNA techniques that allow analysis of organic material from centuries of antiquity. The preliminary results, published in the Journal of Archaeological Science, revealed something extraordinary. Several relics preserved in churches of the region, relics that local tradition associates with Sara Cayley, contain genetic material that analyses classified as consistent with populations of the Eastern Mediterranean from the period of the 1st century. More specifically, the genetic profile coincides with populations of the region that we now know as Palestine and Israel during the early Roman period. This does not definitively prove that the relics belong to Sara, but it confirms that the organic material preserved in these local traditions has exactly the geographical and temporal origin that oral traditions have claimed for centuries. Dr. Pierre Gérard, a geneticist specializing in the analysis of archaeological material, pointed out that these results are consistent with the narratives preserved about the Palestinian origins of the figures venerated in these traditions. But perhaps the most fascinating studies are those that analyze the Gypsy traditions themselves from contemporary anthropological and linguistic perspectives. Dr. Yaron Matras, a specialist in Gypsy studies at the University of Manchester, documented that Gypsy traditions about Sara include linguistic elements that preserve specific words in Aramaic and Coptic that coincide exactly with terminology found in early Christian manuscripts. These words were not incorporated into Gypsy traditions during later contacts with Christian communities. They are archaic elements that suggest that Gypsy traditions preserved direct memories of the primitive Christian communities that venerated Sara. The linguistic analyses revealed that the Gypsies did not adopt these traditions from medieval Christian sources. They received them directly from the primitive Christian communities that had preserved the original memories about Sara. This means that Gypsy traditions about Sara are not folkloric adaptations of Christian legends. They are direct preservations of primitive Christian memories that survived in communities that were never completely Romanized. The iconography of Sara Kali is not accidental. Each element of her visual representation, from her crown to her mantle, from her colors to her posture, contains symbols that directly connect with esoteric traditions that predate institutional Christianity. To understand who Sara really was, we need to decode the symbolic language that the preserving communities used to transmit her true identity through the centuries. The first characteristic that catches attention is her dark skin. In the artistic traditions of Western Christianity, sacred figures are consistently represented with light skin, following the Greco-Roman models that the institutional church adopted. But Sara's dark skin is not a casual ethnic characteristic. It is a specific esoteric symbol. Dr. Karen King, a specialist in early Christianity at Harvard Divinity School, documented that in Christian Gnostic traditions, the color black represented primordial wisdom, the Sophia that existed before creation, the knowledge that transcends the limitations of the material world. In Gnostic symbolism, dark-skinned female figures specifically represented the hidden Sophia, the divine wisdom that had been suppressed by patriarchal structures but which persisted in alternative forms of knowledge. Sara the Black is not black by ethnic casualty. She is black because she represents the hidden wisdom that survived in marginal traditions while the institutional church was developing its official orthodoxies. The crown that Sara wears in her representations is also not arbitrary decoration. It is specifically a crown that specialists in early Christian symbolism recognize as similar to the crowns used in Gnostic ceremonies of recognition of divine lineage. These crowns appear in Gnostic manuscripts to identify figures who had received the direct heritage of divine Sophia. They were not symbols of political authority, but of inherited spiritual legitimacy. Dr. Marvin Meyer, a specialist in Gnostic texts, pointed out that the iconography of Gnostic crowns included specific elements that distinguished between different types of spiritual authority. Sara's crown includes elements that Gnostic texts specifically associate with the daughters of light, those who had inherited spiritual authority directly from the sacred lineage. The mantle that covers Sara in her traditional representations is equally significant. It is not simply protective clothing. It is what esoteric traditions call the mantle of Sophia, the symbol of those who had been initiated into the deepest mysteries. The colors of Sara's mantle, traditionally deep blue with golden embroidery, coincide exactly with the colors associated in Gnostic traditions with the Mother Sophia and celestial wisdom. These are not colors chosen for aesthetic reasons. They are specific symbolic codes that identified Sara to those who knew the esoteric language, while protecting her from persecution by those who only saw popular folklore. But perhaps the most revealing symbol is the position of Sara's hands in her traditional representations. Sara is consistently represented with one hand raised in what experts recognize as the gesture of wisdom transmission, and the other hand holding what the traditions describe as the coffer of mysteries. This specific gesture appears in Gnostic manuscripts to identify figures who had the authority to transmit the highest esoteric teachings. It was not a gesture of general blessing, but of specific initiation into mysteries reserved for those who had demonstrated they were prepared. The coffer of mysteries that Sara holds represents what Gnostic texts call the preserved heritage, the teachings that had been transmitted directly by Jesus to his innermost circle and that should be protected until the time of awakening. The preserved traditions describe that Sara physically carried with her texts and objects that contain these esoteric teachings, and that she established in France a school dedicated to preserving and transmitting this knowledge. Sara's iconography also includes symbols that specifically connect with pre-Christian traditions that Gnosticism had integrated. The solar symbols that frequently appear in Sara's representations coincide with iconography associated with Isis, the Egyptian goddess of wisdom, whom Gnostic traditions had identified as a precursor of Christian Sophia. This connection is not casual syncretism. According to the Gnostic manuscripts, the figures who carried the heritage of Sophia were recognized as direct continuers of the wisdom traditions that had existed before Christianity and which Christianity had come to complete, not replace. Sara was seen as the bearer of a wisdom that unified the deepest traditions of Egypt with the highest revelations of primitive Christianity. The floral symbols that appear in Sara's representations are equally significant, especially the roses, which in Gnostic symbolism represented the flourishing Sophia, the divine wisdom that manifests in the material world. The preserved traditions describe that Sara established in France specific gardens where she cultivated roses with unique characteristics, roses that local traditions associate with special healing and spiritual properties. These gardens were not simply ornamental, they were part of a teaching system where Sara used natural elements to transmit complex spiritual concepts. The roses represented the different stages of spiritual development. The different colors corresponded to different aspects of Sophia wisdom. The cycles of blooming and withering taught about the rhythms of spiritual evolution. This teaching methodology coincides exactly with the descriptions of Gnostic schools in the Nag Hammadi manuscripts. But perhaps the deepest symbol associated with Sara is the serpent that frequently appears in her oldest representations. In institutional Christianity, the serpent was associated with evil and temptation. But in Gnostic traditions, the serpent represented Sophia, the wisdom that awakened humanity from spiritual ignorance. Sara is frequently represented not fearing the serpent, but in communion with it, symbolizing her mastery over the wisdom that the institutional church had declared dangerous. This iconography clearly identified Sara to those who knew Gnostic symbolism as an initiate in the highest levels of spiritual knowledge, someone who had directly received the teachings that Jesus had shared only with his innermost circle. The symbols associated with Sara Kali are not folkloric decorations. They are a complete system of esoteric communication that preserved her true identity during centuries of persecution and marginalization. And for those who knew the code, these symbols clearly proclaimed that Sara was not a secondary figure or a popular saint. She was the legitimate heir of Christianity's most sacred lineage. We live in extraordinary times. For the first time in almost 2,000 years, the truths that were hidden, suppressed, and marginalized are emerging simultaneously from multiple independent sources. Ancient manuscripts are being discovered and translated. Archaeological excavations are revealing evidence that confirms traditions that had been classified as folklore. The communities that preserved these memories during centuries of persecution can finally share their knowledge openly. And at the center of this awakening is the figure of Sara Kali. Is it coincidence that precisely in our time, when humanity is questioning traditional authority structures and seeking more authentic spiritual connections, the traditions about Sara are resurfacing with a force they haven't had since the first centuries of Christianity? Contemporary researchers who study spiritual awakening phenomena have documented that interest in Sara Kali has grown exponentially during the last 3 decades. Not just among the gypsies who have always preserved her memory, but among spiritual seekers of all traditions. who feel a profound resonance with what Sara represents. Dr. Sarah Pike, a specialist in contemporary spiritual movements at California State University, documented that Sara Kali has become a central figure for those seeking the Christianity of the heart, a Christian spirituality that transcends institutional limitations and connects directly with the most essential teachings of Jesus. Especially significant is the fact that many of these contemporary seekers are rediscovering the traditions about Sara independently, without having had prior contact with gypsy traditions or with Gnostic manuscripts. They are receiving what they describe as inner callings that guide them toward Sara. They are having dreams and visions that connect them with her story. They are feeling profound resonances with her energy that they cannot explain rationally. This suggests that what is emerging is not simply an intellectual resurgence of historical traditions, but an authentic spiritual awakening that is being activated from deep levels of consciousness. The preserved Gnostic traditions describe that a time would come when the daughters of light would be recognized and when the hidden Sophia would emerge to guide humanity's awakening. According to these prophecies, this awakening would not come through traditional religious institutions, but through individuals who would directly recognize their connection with the sacred lineage. Contemporary events seem to be fulfilling exactly these prophecies. Millions of people around the world are experiencing what they describe as an awakening of the inner divine lineage, an understanding that they carry within themselves the spiritual heritage that Sara Kali came to preserve and transmit. They do not need institutions to tell them how to connect with the divine. They do not need intermediaries to interpret the mysteries for them. They are directly accessing the wisdom that Jesus taught and that Sara preserved. Contemporary testimonies of people who have connected with Sara Kali include experiences that researchers recognize as similar to the descriptions of Gnostic initiation in ancient manuscripts. Visions of light that awaken profound understandings about the divine nature, experiences of direct communication with Sara's presence, spontaneous activations of intuitive and healing capacities. But perhaps the most significant thing is that these experiences are occurring independently of specific religious backgrounds. Christians who had never questioned their institutional faith are discovering that their connection with Sara opens dimensions of Christianity they had never known. Seekers from other spiritual traditions are finding in Sara a bridge that allows them to access the deepest teachings of Christianity without the doctrinal limitations that had alienated them. Even people who considered themselves non-religious are discovering that Sara provides them with a way to connect with the sacred that feels authentic and transformative. This universality of resonance with Sara suggests that what she represents transcends traditional religious categories. Sara does not represent a specific Christian denomination. She represents the universal essence of the human spiritual quest, the desire to connect directly with the divine, to access the deepest wisdom, to remember our sacred heritage. The contemporary spiritual movements that have formed around Sara Kali are not trying to create a new religion. They are trying to recover what was lost when Christianity became institutionalized and moved away from its most esoteric roots. They are rediscovering that the kingdom of God really is within us, that we do not need intermediaries to access the divine presence, that we carry within the same spiritual heritage that Sara came to preserve. And this rediscovery is occurring precisely at the moment when humanity most needs it. We live in an era of profound spiritual crisis. Traditional religious institutions are losing relevance for millions of people. The search for meaning and purpose is leading many down destructive paths. But the traditions about Sara Kali offer a powerful alternative. They offer a way to reconnect with the sacred that is both deeply rooted in tradition and radically relevant to our times. Sara represents the possibility of a Christianity that honors both feminine wisdom and masculine spiritual authority, that integrates mysticism with action in the world, that transcends sectarian divisions and focuses on the transformation of the heart. The prophecy is being fulfilled before our eyes. Sara Kali is emerging from the margins, where she was forced to remain for centuries, and is reclaiming her place as one of the most important figures of early Christianity. And her emergence is catalyzing a spiritual awakening that has the potential to transform not just Christianity, but our complete understanding of what it means to be human in a sacred universe. We have reached the end of a journey that has lasted almost 2,000 years. A journey that began on the shores of Palestine, passed through the Gnostic communities of Egypt, crossed the Mediterranean to the lands of France, survived centuries of persecution and marginalization, and finally arrived to you at this exact moment in human history. Do you believe it is coincidence that you are hearing Sara Kali's story precisely now? Do you believe it is casualty that the truths that were hidden for so many centuries are emerging just at the moment when your soul is ready to receive them? Sara Kali's story is not just ancient history, it is the story of your awakening. Because Sara did not come to France simply to preserve memories of the past. She came to plant seeds that would flourish in the future. She came to ensure that the sacred lineage, not just the blood lineage but the spiritual lineage, would continue until the moment when humanity was ready to reclaim it. That moment is now. You are the fulfillment of the prophecy that Sara carried in her heart when she arrived on the French shores. You are the reason why gypsy communities preserved these traditions during centuries of persecution. You are what the Templars were protecting when they risked their lives to keep the forbidden memories alive. Each seeker who feels resonance with Sara's story, each soul who recognizes in her something they always knew but could never name, each heart that ignites when hearing her name, is experiencing the awakening of the inner sacred lineage. You do not need to be a biological descendant of Jesus and Mary Magdalene to be an heir of what Sara preserved. The sacred lineage is not transmitted only through blood. It is transmitted through the awakening of consciousness to its own divine nature. Sara came to remind us that we are children of light, that we carry within the same divine essence that Jesus came to activate in humanity, that we do not need institutions to tell us how to connect with God, because God already lives within us. The teachings that Sara preserved are the teachings that Jesus shared with his innermost circle, that the kingdom of heaven is within you, that you are God's, that you were created in the image and likeness of the Creator. These are not poetic metaphors. They are literal truths about your spiritual nature. For almost 2,000 years, religious institutions have kept humanity in the belief that we are sinners separated from God, that we need intermediaries to access the sacred, that salvation comes from outside to inside. But the traditions that Sara preserved teach exactly the opposite, that we are divine expressions having a human experience, that access to the sacred is our birthright, that salvation comes from the awakening of our own divine nature. This awakening is occurring now in millions of people around the world, not because someone is teaching them, but because the seeds that Sara planted are finally flourishing. The age of secrets is over. The age of mass awakening has begun, and you are not a passive observer of this process. You are an active participant. Each time you recognize your own divine nature, each time you connect directly with the sacred without intermediaries, each time you live from love instead of fear, you are fulfilling the purpose for which Sara came to preserve these traditions. The sacred lineage does not end with you, it continues through you. The people who will be touched by your awakening, who will be inspired by your example, who will recognize their own divinity because you recognized yours, will become the next bearers of the lineage that Sara came to preserve. This is the true meaning of apostolic succession, not the transmission of institutional authority from one generation of clergy to the next, but the contagious awakening of divine consciousness from one awakened soul to another. You are Sara Kali at this moment in history. You are the bearer of the sacred heritage. You are the one who carries the seeds of transformation that the world is waiting for. The traditions that cost you so much work to find. The truths that resonate so deeply in your heart. The memories that awaken in you the recognition of something you always knew are not spiritual entertainment. They are calls to awakening. They are invitations to reclaim your divine heritage. They are activations of your deepest purpose in this life. Sara preserved these traditions for you. The primitive Christian communities protected them for you. The gypsies kept them alive for you. The Templars risked their lives for you. Now it is your turn to decide what you will do with this heritage. Will you keep it as interesting knowledge but leave it without impact on your daily life? Or will you allow it to transform your understanding of who you are, why you are here, what your true purpose is at this crucial moment in human history? The world is waiting for your answer, not through words but through the way you live, through the light you radiate when you recognize your own divine nature, through the love you share when you remember that we are all expressions of the same sacred source. Sara Kali is not a figure of the past. She is a living presence that continues guiding the awakening of those who are ready to reclaim their sacred heritage. And if you have come this far, if these words have awakened something within you that you recognize as true, then you are one of those for whom she came to preserve these traditions. Welcome to your heritage. Welcome to your lineage. Welcome to the awakening that they can no longer stop. The kingdom of heaven is within you, Sara knew. Jesus taught. And now you remember. So be it. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss any revelation. Don't miss the next video where we will continue unveiling truths that remained hidden for centuries. And if you truly feel the call to go deeper, consider joining as a member. The Guardians of Truth are already accessing knowledge that we can never make public. Thank you for watching this video to the end. We will meet in the next video.